Okay, let's take a look at exercise this 53 through 58 of section 2.7, where we're going to um, look at two functions f and g that are defined by tables. We're going to use the tables to evaluate each composite function. So our first task is to find f of g of 8. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the chart that tells us about g of x. And we see if x is 8, g is 4. So g of 8 is 4. So we're going to replace our g of 8 with 4. So this is actually the same as calculating f of 4. So we are going to go to the table that tells us about f, and when x is 4, we see that f is 0. So f of 4 equals 0. Now we're going to do f of g of 3, and we're going to follow the same line of thinking. If x is 3, g is negative 4. We get that information just by looking at the table. So this is the same as f of negative 4. Now let's go to the table that gives us information about f. And we see that if x is negative 4, f is 1. So f of negative 4 is 1. Now this notation means g of f, for number 55, of negative 3. We're going to follow the same line of thinking. We go to the table that tells us about f, and when x is negative 3, we see that f is 2. So this is the same as g of 2. Now we go to the table that tells us about g. So when x is 2, g is negative 5. So g of 2 is negative 5. So let's take a look at f inverse of g of 0. So what we have to understand is that we need a table that gives us information about f inverse. So an easy way to do that is to make a table right underneath the table that gives us information about f that tells us about x and f inverse. And that's very easily done. Whatever my function values are in this table, these are now in my new table that I'm making going to become my x values. The y values are now going to be found by using the x values of this table. So I'm simply interchanging x and y to get my new table. Notice all I did was interchange x and y. And I could do exactly the same thing with g to get g inverse. All of the y values from the g table become my x values on the g inverse table. All of my x values on the g table become my y values on the g inverse table. So again, all I'm doing is interchanging x and y. That's all I'm doing. And now we can answer the last two questions. We're going to take 0 and put that into G. And that's going to be our input to F inverse. So from the table that tells us about G, we see that G of 0 is 2. So number 57 is actually F inverse of 2. Now I go to the table that tells me about F inverse. And I see that when x is 2, F inverse is negative 3. Now I am going to do number 58, where G inverse of f of 1 is what I'm trying to calculate. So what is it that I'm actually putting into G inverse? Well, as I can see, I'm putting in f of 1. So I go to the table that tells me about f, and I see that I actually can't calculate that, so I'm going to change this problem. Okay, so now I've made the appropriate change here. This was a typo. I left out the inverse on F inverse. So G inverse of F inverse of 1 tells me to take 1 and put it into F inverse, and that result is negative 4. So I'm really calculating G inverse of negative 4. So F inverse of 1 is negative 4. So I'm actually calculating G inverse of negative 4. So I go to the table that gives me information about G inverse, and I see that G inverse of negative 4 is 3. So that's my result for this one. So all I'm doing is step by step making the problem simpler and simpler at each step. So I'm actually finding a function value and replacing it with its numerical value. That's really all that I'm doing at each step. And notice, to find the values for the inverse functions, I have to make a new table, and the y's on f are the x values for f inverse. The x values on the table for f are the y values for f inverse. So I'm interchanging x and y's to get the table for the inverse functions. And it's actually not a difficult problem if you understand the reflective property of a function and its inverse, and you also understand what composition of functions mean. So if you need to, rewind the video and watch it as many times as you need to understand what's going on here. Good luck.